Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Edwards. I'm curator of European art here at the Kimball, and we've got a great crowd tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our program this evening. And I'm sure all of you have been enjoying this fantastic exhibition that we have of treasures from the Holy Sepulcher. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Shimon Gibson. He comes to us with a wealth of experience, having worked in the Holy Land for some 40 years. He's a British-born archaeologist who has been full-time professor of practice in the history department at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte since 2017. Shimon studied at the Institute of Archaeology, University College in London, where he completed his PhD in landscape archaeology in the southern Levant. Between 1996 and 1999, Shimon served as assistant director of the Excavations and Surveys Department in the Israel Antiquities Authority. He headed the archaeology department of the University of the Holy Land in Jerusalem from 2000 until he relocated to Charlotte in 2017. During the past 20 years, Shimon has conducted numerous archaeological excavation projects and field surveys throughout Israel, including the southern desert region. He's currently co-directing excavations at Mount Zion, most recently in July of 23, and he was also a longtime chief editor of the archaeological journal Bulletin of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. He's written some more than 100 research articles that span a variety of subjects and archaeological periods. He's co-authored monographs on the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, another on the Temple Mount, and co-edited the Archaeology and History of the Church of the Redeemer and the Meristan in Jerusalem. I'll mention some other books, since you see he's a very busy person. They include Jerusalem in Original Photographs, because another of his interests is in photography. A popular book entitled The Cave of St. John the Baptist, Flights into Biblical Archaeology, The Final Days of Jesus, The Archaeological Evidence, and a book on tourists, travelers, and hotels in 19th century Jerusalem. Relevant to today's talk, his most recent article, as I understand it, is the topography underlying the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem. And we're very lucky that Shimon has just very recently been to Jerusalem and in the church, and will be able to share some very recent discoveries with us tonight. And I'll mention that Shimon may be familiar to you, too, as a commentator in numerous television documentaries on archaeology and history produced for outlets like National Geographic, Discovery, the History Channel, and so on. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce, and please help me to welcome, Shimon Gibson.
Thank you for that introduction, Nancy. I'm very happy to be here at Kimball Art Museum. I went through the Church of the Holy Sepulcher exhibition. Amazing. If you haven't seen it yet, you must. It is a great joy to be here. Jerusalem is a very, very special place. It's a place that is close to my heart. In fact, there's a kind of sort of love affair between myself and that city. It is a city that is extremely ancient, goes back at least 8,000 years, but it is a city that has no resources, no minerals, nothing that would really attract people, you would think. It has a spring of water, It has some agricultural plots and terraces, but nothing really beyond that. And when you think about it, this is a place where an enormous amount of battles have taken place. More than 114 sieges and battles have taken place at that location. The reason for that is because it is a place of holiness. The ground emanates the sense of holiness, and this is reflected in its stones. And as an archaeologist, historian, I'm deeply attracted to uncovering things from out of the ground. In a way, the stones cry out. They want our attention. They want my attention. And Jerusalem, of course, has many holy sites. Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. There are other mosques and synagogues and churches scattered around Jerusalem, reflecting all sorts of traditions. And today I want to talk about the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, which is a place which has been connected to my own personal history ever since I started doing some excavations there back in August of 1975. I'm a bit of a relic myself. This is a very old aerial photograph of Jerusalem. You're viewing Jerusalem from the south, and the reason I show it is because Jerusalem has been transformed over the years, and it's very difficult to see its original contours. But here you can see the Tyropoeon Valley. This is the southeastern hill. This is the area of Mount Zion. And then you can see the Temple Mount and the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. If I advance one, you can see the three important places here, including the Room of the Last Supper, which is on the summit of Mount Zion. And it's been a pleasure, and it's also been a task which I've enjoyed very much, collating the data regarding these three sites. I publish a very detailed book together with a colleague, David Jacobson, on the underground spaces and cisterns of the Temple Mount, a book on the Church of Holy Sepulcher that Nancy mentioned, that I wrote together with Joan Taylor, and I'm currently working on a book now on the historical and archaeological remains that exist in and around the Room of the Last Supper, Hagia Sion, the church there from the Byzantine period. So I've been involved in all of these different areas, and I'm conducting excavations outside of those three locations. This is a modern view, which is taken by a student of mine, Joel Kramer, who's doing some excellent video work, by the way, which you can see on YouTube. You're looking at the old city from the southwest, looking towards the northeast. And if I progress one slide, you can see that is where the Church of the Holy Sepulcher is situated. Now, this is a bit of a problem for many historians when you go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, because according to Jewish custom, and this is something that everybody knew about even then, Jewish tombs had to be situated outside the city walls, not inside the city. Hence, there's a bit of a problem because the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, marking the tomb of Jesus as well as the place of the crucifixion, is located within the city walls. Hence, in 1883, General Gordon, when he arrived in Jerusalem, decided that the Church of the Holy Sepulcher could not be at the traditional spot, that it had to be outside of Jerusalem. He positioned it outside, just to the north. There's a wonderful place called the Garden Tomb. If any of you have visited Jerusalem, go there. It's beautiful, but it is not the traditional spot. In fact, it is an Iron Age tomb that was then adapted for burial by Byzantine monks probably in the 5th or 6th centuries CE. and it cannot be the tomb of Jesus. But it is a place that has a lot of atmosphere. I would suggest going there. So let's advance into the old city and then make our way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And on the left, you can see an aerial view of the complex that contains the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see the rotunda represented by the grey dome here. And then please note the layout of the streets of the Muristan, the area immediately to the south of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because it really reflects the road or street layout of Aelia Capitolina, there's pagan Jerusalem, from roughly the 130 CE and all the way up to the 4th century. So you have the church that was built by Constantine the Great, installed within the area of this layout of streets dating back to the late Roman period, and within the area that we believe served as the forum and had a shrine to Venus. But more about that later. I want you to look at the facade of the church on the right. Look at the windows up at the top on the right. You'll see a little ladder. Do you see the ladder there? And this is the immovable ladder, as it's known, since beginning of the 18th century onwards. This ladder has not moved, or so they say, because of disputes between the ecclesiastical authorities within the church. And as you know, the church is divided up between the Franciscan Catholic community. You have the Armenian Patriarchate that is in charge of certain parts. You have the Greek Orthodox there, and also smaller communities that hold other parts as well. And in the past, not in recent history, but in the past, if you stepped from the paving stones of the Greek Orthodox community onto the paving stones of the Armenian community, all sorts of fights could break out, and death might even ensue. So breaking the status quo, the agreement that existed regarding all sorts of features within a church, this was something that had to be maintained, the status quo, and you didn't want to break the status quo. Hence, the ladder has remained in that place all this time. Now, I've examined the ladder. The ladders cannot be from the early 18th century. And in fact, I've got proof. There's in the 1960s, restorations were made to the facade of the church. And there you can see that the ladder is not there. So for a while, anyway, they may have hidden it away and brought it out later. Now, the church has always been of great interest to scholars going all the way back to medieval times, and you have representations of the church facade from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Here you have De Bruyne's depiction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see the top image, and then lower at the bottom, you can see, especially on the left, you can see the area of the rotunda with the edicule, which means small house, which covers the tomb of Jesus. Now, in 1810, a massive fire broke out, and as a result, the edicule had to be rebuilt. So we are reliant upon some of these engravings, at least concerning the medieval aspects relating to the edicule. So here you can see on the left, you can see one from an engraving showing the parvis. This is the courtyard that it fronts the facade of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On the right, you've got another ladder, but it's not the same ladder that I was talking about, leaning against the doorway. And at the bottom, you can see the Greek Orthodox Easter celebrations, the miracle of the fire. Now, let's just sum up very briefly. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but it is pertinent to some of the things I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to be showing you images from the recent excavations at the Church of Holy Sepulcher. And I'm sure you've heard about some of them from the internet and from their various sources. And I'm very lucky to have as a friend the director of that expedition. And so she has been able to provide me with details, and especially for you, you're in a unique position. She provided me with the most recent findings, the illustrations of the findings, so that I could show you tonight. So this is quite something. But the first real survey that was made of the church building complex was made by Charles Wilson, who conducted work in the winter of 1864, 1865, and then published his findings in 1866. He was a captain from the Royal Engineers in England, and he was sent out to survey the city. And he did a wonderful plan of the existing church. And now we're going to sort of jump forward. I know there's quite a long period in between, going all the way to the 1960s. But I can just mention that following that, you had all sorts of different people. William Harvey, for instance, who made another detailed survey in at the beginning of the 20th century, 1840s, in order to prepare for the restorations which would have to ensue during the latter part of the 20th century, and indeed they did, in stages. And the person who was in charge was an architect, but also a Dominican priest, Charles Quanon, from École Biblique, and he did a very good job and published a book, the Schweich Lectures, with his findings, specific to the earlier periods and also the Constantinian complex, with his reconstruction of what the church complex might have looked like at the time of Constantine. This was followed by the work of a Franciscan priest archaeologist, Virgilio Corbo, from the Studium Biblicum Franciscum. And they, of course, are connected to the exhibition that exists upstairs. And he monitored all of the work which was done whenever somebody dug a pit under the paving stones or removed a wall. He would be there to document it all. And he produced a very good book relating to that. Now we're going to jump all the way into the future to 2016 to 2017, where you had an agreement between the different ecclesiastical authorities, and Antonio Moapoulou, who's from Athens, directed an amazing project to restore the Edicule, to go into the Edicule itself, which, as I mentioned, is that structure that was built after the fire of 1810, and it was in a very bad state. It had the iron scaffolding, which was set up by the British to support this structure so it shouldn't collapse. But owing to the possibility that it might collapse while pilgrims were inside, it was decided to do this work, and Antonia Moapoulou conducted that work, and she opened the tomb, the actual tomb itself, which is a bench with the marble covering, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute. The recent excavations, which have now been completed, was run from 2022 by Francesca Romana Stassola from the Sapienza University of Rome. And there are different discoveries, and I'll talk about them shortly. So, what about the people who had something to do with the Church of Holy Sepulcher? Well, from right at the top on the left, you can see Charles Wilson that I mentioned. He did the essential first mapping of the church complex. There were others as well. Some we don't really have much information, like Father Antonin. He was a Russian research explorer, and he conducted excavations in the Nevsky section of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre complex. And then you have Conrad Schick. He looks like he's a very grumpy old fellow, you see up here. But I can tell you, I've read all his letters, his archival letters, and he was such a sweet person. He just looks grumpy, but he isn't. And then you have, here you have Father Corbo, who I mentioned, a Franciscan archaeologist who dug in other places like Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. And he did an amazing job because it meant monitoring all of this work there. And then next to him is Antonia Moropoulou. On the far left, at the bottom, you have Charles Coanon, the architect. This is the only picture I could find of him. He just didn't like being photographed. And then you have myself, together with my friend Francesca Stasola, who is the director of all of these recent excavations in the church, posing there next to all the crates of artifacts which have been uncovered. And then, of course, there's me, and here you can see me in 1988. I was quite a handsome guy then, wasn't I? No longer, unfortunately. But there I am, together with my colleague, Joan Taylor, and we started doing research, because at that time, apart from the work of Corbo that was published in 1982, there was nothing else, and nothing in English. So we decided to produce this volume. You can see the cover on the left. And we summed up all information, did new archival work, and published also all excavations we could come across that had not been published by Corbo. So I think at the time, for that point in time when it was published in 1994, this was quite an achievement. Here we are posing on the roof of the Church of Holy Sepulchre, where you have the Crusader period cloisters. Now, I mentioned beforehand that there was a problem that scholars had, and that is that the tomb seemingly was situated within the city. As you can see here, I put in a circle there, you have the church. So you had various sort of scholars like George Finlay debating or summing up all of the data that was available to him in the 1840s. And he has this kind of sort of convoluted fortification wall, which runs around here topographically and then makes a kind of indentation there and then runs around the rest of the city, including the Temple Mount. It doesn't really seem reasonable. However, this is my map on the left here. You can see this is what we know now as a result of all of the archaeological excavations. And you can see that Golgotha, the tomb of Jesus, is indeed outside the city wall of the year 70. So that no longer poses a problem. There are other problems, of course, because the more archaeologists reveal information, the more we understand that we still need to find out much more, and that our ignorance comes out as a result of the excavations we conduct. So that propels us forward, of course. On the right, you can see my photograph, which was taken after Moropoulou had conducted and completed her work on the Edicule. And you can see they cleaned it up, and all that iron scaffolding that you'll see in a minute had been removed. Now, I should also mention that prior to this, back in the 1990s, Martin Biddle, who was a medieval historian in England, did a project. And this is what the Edicule looked like. Look, it was completely covered with soot. I know this is done in sort of semi-darkness, but I can tell you it's still covered with soot. And along the edges, you have this iron scaffolding, which was put in by the British. And you can already see how the fissures on the side here, this was a structure about to collapse. And that really propelled the agreement between the authorities to clean the structure and to restore it. That's me posing next to showing the evidence of the imminent collapse. Anyway, as a result of his work and the publication of his book, Tomb of Christ, this kind of sort of opened the doors to the work being undertaken by a collection of not archaeologists, but architects, engineers, experts in earthquake aspects, etc., etc., etc. She did a wonderful job. I was at the time the consultant for the Armenian community, so I had access to all of their reports which are coming in, which are quite interesting. So if we're going to be acquainting ourselves with the church, you can see the numbers here. Number 1 is the forecourt, that's the parvis. And then you have the entrance, number 3. On the right, you have, at a higher level, cavalry, the place of, the traditional place of the crucifixion of Jesus. And other features, let me just mention here, number 3, which is the edicule within the circular rotunda. And then to the far right, you can see the chapel of St. Helena, the place where the cross, remnants of the cross were found, reputedly by Helena in number 6, Cave of the Invention of the Cross, and 7, Chapel of St. Vartan, and I'll talk about some of those excavations. I just put up here the 7th century map of Arculf, who was a pilgrim who was recording the pilgrimage of Domnan, and he made a map, which is quite interesting in terms of its details. And at the lower right, you have the map, which was made by Conrad Schick. Remember the guy who looks like he's in a foul mood, but he's actually a sweet person? Well, that's his map. He really did an amazing job back in the 1890s. He also was a model maker, Conrad Schick, and you can see his model of the Church of Holy Sepulcher that you could dismantle, and you could see all these different levels, all the different rooms. This, of course, is the rotunda. You can see the edicule at that spot, and you can see the roof. You can see the parvis, the entranceway to the church. But it is a very large complex. And here you can see some of the restorations which are taking place. The dome, which you see up here, was replaced in 1867 because it was about to collapse as a result of the 1810 fire. And then from that moment onwards and all the way up to modern times, restorations have been undertaken. So in terms of the timeline, we have, as you can read yourselves, the Roman period. So we've got the 1st century CE, the time of around about 30 CE, the crucifixion and burial of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. 130 to 136, you have Hadrian, the Roman emperor, who rebuilds Aelia Capitolina and basically buries the tomb beneath the forum and builds a pagan temple dedicated to Venus on top. In the Byzantine period, you have, according to sources, Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, being in Jerusalem and identifying fragments of the Holy Cross. There's a problem. Drivers and other scholars have pointed out that some of these traditions might be traditions that were created a little later on, especially since Eusebius, who is our main source for the rediscovery of the tomb and the building of the martyrium, which was the basilica, and the edicule over the tomb, doesn't mention Helena at all, and which is a bit strange. We have the dedication of the church by at the time of Constantine the Great, the first, and then the first major disaster in 614. The Persians invade Jerusalem and they burn a lot of the churches in Jerusalem. And that results in some major changes, which then have result when they start restoring the churches, including the Church of Holy Sepulcher. Now, I'm not going in this lecture because there's so much to be said about the Church of Holy Sepulcher, and I don't want to keep you all night. So I'm going to stay with the earlier periods, the period of Jesus and beforehand and afterwards in terms of the early church and the edicule. Excuse me. So let's start with this new project, and then we'll work our way backwards and have a look at some of the other facets. As I promised, and I really have to thank my friend here, Francesca Stasola, for providing me with images that have never been seen, or by mostly by fellow scholars in conferences and such like. So you're really provided with a special advantage in seeing this. You can see the Edicule here, and you can see that she was removing the floors with her wonderful team. She had a very large team of people working on it. And then the map itself shows the different parts of the church building where she was removing the paving, because it is a site that pilgrims flock to and have been doing so in large numbers. It had to be done in stages so that there will be access to the Church of the Holy Sepulcher at all times. And so she was working there sometimes at night, and so during the time when the doors of the Church of Holy Sepulchre were closed, or she segregated various parts of the church so she could undertake the work. What about the earliest periods represented under the church? And that fits in very well with the article that Nancy mentioned. Concerning the topography, the underlying topography of the church, which I published recently, and it reflects all that we knew about the underlying topography up to these current excavations. Okay, so what you can see here are these quarrying marks. You can see here these step-like stones. They would remove stones. It was a very large quarry, probably about 300 meters by 300 meters in size, extensive area. And you also have soil, accumulating soil and stone chips with Iron Age artifacts as well, dating from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE. Here you can see various ideas concerning the underlying topography that was published by different people at different times. The earliest is Joseph Scholes, you can see up here, these are mostly drawings taken from archives. And you can see the various areas. You can see the C is the tomb. Here it's B on this map. This is the very well-known one that was created by Dominican priest Van San. Published in 1914 with his colleague Abel. It doesn't show what the underlying topography looked like at the time of Jesus, which is a problem. It shows all rock cuttings, including all the rock cuttings which were made for the foundations of the walls of the church. So Father Cobo attempted to try and reconstruct what the underlying bedrock surface with the quarrying, with the tomb of Jesus shown here in this drawing with all sorts of arrows going in different directions. I don't really agree with him with that. This is my own map, which I created back then in 1988, where I worked out all of the elevations above sea level, as you can see here. These are elevations above sea level, so it's 743.75 at that point, and that's the rock of Golgotha. And here you can see the tomb of Jesus. Sorry, here the tomb of Jesus. So here, number 21. And then there's an additional tomb over here and another one over here as well. But it allows one to reconstruct the underlying topography. I'm sure that the work of Stasala will change much of this, but this for the moment is what we understand. And I put it here, it's in simplified form, just so to highlight sort of some of the areas. You can see place of the crucifixion, the rock of Golgotha, quarry cave down here, and the various sort of tombs. So when the tomb of Jesus was created there, it was cut into one of the scarps of this rock-cut quarry, and the place of the crucifixion, if indeed this is the place of crucifixion, because the problem is that the rock itself is like a shaft of rock which extends upwards, and it seems an impossibility. Here you can see my photograph taken in 1988 of the uppermost part. It was exposed, and I was allowed in to take photographs. You're seeing it not visible today. You can see the edge of it in the chapel of the Calvary. But here you can see my drawing here. That's the top there. And it's something like 7 meters on one side and even deep on the other. They would have had to climb up in order to carry out the crucifixion. So what I have suggested that when they made all these changes to the area, they modified the rock surface and they left this as a memorial of the place of the crucifixion. So it's not the actual place of crucifixion, it's a memorial of the general location because they were doing building activities there and they had to modify the area quite substantially. If we just go backwards a little bit, the place of the trial of Jesus, because that's where he was prior to be taken to that area for crucifixion, was here at this spot. I know that all guidebooks and most books would indicate that it was to the north of the Temple Mount in the area of the beginning of the Via Dolorosa, but we know archaeologically that the Praetorium, the place of where the Roman governor sat, including Pontius Pilate, was in the old palace of Herod the Great, and we know where the old palace of Herod the Great is. In fact, I've excavated parts of it, including the gate leading, at this point here, leading into the Praetorium. And so it seems to me that this was the place where Jesus was brought in front of Pontius Pilate. And the question then is, was he led outside the city, which is unlikely, or through the city, so that they could demonstrate that if you went against the Roman authorities, this is the fate that you would suffer. So Jesus was dragged through with all the way to the northern gate, the Gennet gate, and then outside the city to the place where crucified. And you have the quote there from the Gospel of John at the bottom that in the place of the crucifixion you have a garden, and that fits in well with that brown soil that I spoke about in that quarry, which we came across, and Francesca Stesola in her excavations has come across as well. But before we get there, I just want to sort of mention a little bit about crucifixion. There's been some major sort of breakthroughs in understanding the process of crucifixion as a result of modern research. You're seeing a picture of the very famous heel bone with a iron nail in it, found in a cave, a tomb on the north side of Jerusalem. It's not of Jesus, but it is of somebody who was crucified roughly at the time of Jesus. And so it helps us understand that the crucifixion was not as is sometimes depicted in some of those wonderful paintings which you have here in the Kimball Art Museum, but his legs were probably placed on both sides, you see here, not one above the other, and his arms had to have been attached with rope, though they probably with nails into the hands, but from behind. And the reason for the ropes is if you didn't have ropes there, then the body would have propelled forward, and within minutes you'd have asphyxiation. And the Romans wanted to carry out crucifixion with absolute pain, and you're not going to get that if the person dies straight away. Note down below Professor Hershkovitz, who examined recently scanning the heel bone and found that the Romans were very particular. The reason they put it into the heel bone is because you have, and you can see on the left there, that's the spot where all the nerve endings congregate. The idea is to inflict maximum pain on the person who is being crucified. In terms of the topography, we now know that's the Praetorium, not an Antonia Fortress here. Hence, the place of traditional Golgotha makes great sense. Coming back to the excavations conducted by Professor Stesola, you can see here she found a kind of sort of street or path, a cobble street, which led, forget this above, that's of later date. We're talking about the cobbled area down here. So maybe in between the quarry or leading to the tombs, you had this kind of sort of path. By the way, she did some amazing sort of work looking at pollen and the botanical remains carbonized, so she could identify the remains of olive and trees and grapevines. So probably there were gardens. This was the garden that the Gospel of John perhaps refers to. Now, following the burial of Jesus and then the empty tomb, and I won't go into that any further, what happens is that the Romans in the year 130, so that is roughly 100 years later, decide to rebuild Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, a pagan city, and they establish the 10th Legion camp here. That you can see it here in this recent work, which I've done, trying to trace the exact position of the 10th Legion camp, and you can see that as Aelia Capitolina expanded, these are the canabae, these are the kind of outlying districts connected to the camp, and then turned into this city. And in red there, I've indicated the place of where the tomb used to be, which had now become the Temple of Venus. And I put here this statue of Venus, which was found in the Church of St. John the Baptist in excavations there to the west of Jerusalem. So we don't know what Venus looked like in that shrine in Jerusalem, but we do know of that one, which is contemporary in Encarum. Inside the church, Professor Stassola found these kind of accumulated fills inside, including this tile, which reads LEG for Legion and X for 10. So it's the 10th Roman Legion. So there was a lot of building activities in that area, including this wall, which she uncovered, extending from west to east. And this is my reconstruction from 1994. Parts of this wall, a little, maybe just that bit there, you can see in white, have been exposed by Corbo, but Professor Stassola has now their entire length, and this is a kind of sort of reconstruction that is now being proposed, perhaps. This one is based on Father Corbo's work. You can see there are differences of opinion. The problem is that we only have the foundations of these buildings there of the Forum and of the temple. These are underlying walls which were built to consolidate the fills and to cover all of these areas of a quarry. You can't establish a Roman Forum inside a stone quarry, which has all sorts of different levels and pits, deep pits and tombs, and so they covered everything up. They filled it all up, and then they established their forum, the paving of the forum. And I think that the top of that memorial that I mentioned, which is indicated as place of the crucifixion, was seen. Melitos of Sardis, as a pilgrim, mentions seeing that. And I think that's how the memory of the place of the tomb of Jesus and the place of the crucifixion could be maintained, because they could see at the level of the paving, the top of that rock, the rock that I showed you, the picture I took in 1988. And that would make sense. And that would mean that when Constantine sends his bishop, Caius, and says, go and do some archaeological excavations in Jerusalem, dig up and find me the tomb of Jesus, he goes and he knows exactly where to dig. I'm always amazed by that, that he digs a hole in the ground and finds the tomb of Jesus. So Constantine the Great, you can see him in this portrait here right at the top, this sculpted head. He changes this whole area. He reveals the tomb. He builds the first edicule, this structure which is over the tomb. I think he does cut back the rock. And in Stassola's excavations, you can see that the rock has been kind of flattened there with the addition of sort of paving stones. This all dates from the time of Constantine the Great, as I understand it. So here you can see a representation of what that edicule might have looked like from the Byzantine period, mid-6th century in Ravenna. And these are photographs inside the edicule. See, the tomb of Jesus is there, and this is in the chamber of that precedes it. The chamber you can see here, bits of walls, and then on the outside you can see remains of a circular wall there, which fits in with the circular walls that you see here. So it's really quite amazing how everything is coming together. The medieval Edicule was different. Remember, there was a destruction there by the Persians in 614, and then Caliph Hakim then reduces the tomb, intentionally apparently, all the way down to its foundations. And so in the medieval period, it's rebuilt, and here you have a picture of what the Edicule looked like in the medieval period. You can see that's the chamber. These are the two this is the chamber which is in front, what I just showed you, where excavations took place, and here you can see a representation of the tomb. There are other engravings. This one I came across, which is quite interesting. It says, "A view of the inside or a section of our Lord's Sepulcher." The ground plan of our Lord's Sepulcher here on the left. You can see that's the front area, and then you've got this area here where Jesus' body was placed on in a vestibule, not a vestibule, on a bench under the arcasolia there. And you can see kind of remnants of walls there. How accurate it is, and whether or not this engraver decided to take his artistic imagination to a great distance, it's difficult to tell. But as I mentioned, Antonia Moropoulou and her team from the National Technical University of Athens decided then to go in and conduct as many scientific examinations as possible. You can see how it looks today, but when you go in, there's a small area, and on the right, under this arch, you've got this bench, and that's where the tomb of where the body of Jesus was laid to rest, according to tradition, and it's covered with marble. You see here. And right at the top, and this is courtesy of National Geographic, they removed that plaque that you see here and found remains of an earlier cover. You can see just part of it preserved there with a rock beneath it. This, by the way, is my drawing based on that very detailed research they did, because they scanned at different levels the rock remnants that had been clearly destroyed by Hakim in 1003 or thereabouts. But what is interesting is it does allow one to reconstruct, and here's my reconstruction on the right, a rectangular, because you see one wall here, one wall there. That drawing I showed you before might be a part of the bedrock that existed on this side with an entrance. If so, then we can reconstruct it this way. Now, I'm sure you all know the gospel sources that talk about the rolling away of the stone from the entrance. That would imply that it's round, but not so, because the Greek simply means the stone was rolled away, but you can roll a square stone away. And small chambers, tomb chambers from all of the thousands of tombs that have been excavated from this period, and many of them I've researched myself. I've researched 63 in the Field of Blood in Akeldama with a colleague, Boazisu. Simple chambers, which are not expanded, usually are covered, or the entrance is blocked with a square stone. So that seems to be the case here. Now, in terms of the Constantinian remains excavated by Stesola, I just want to go back to 1971 over here, when an accidental discovery revealed, and here you can see the map at the top here, part of the apse of the large martyrium, which was the basilica, which was built there to remember Jesus. In front of the martyrium, you have this kind of open area, and then you have the Edicule. And it seems, as a result of the recent excavations by Francesca Stesola, that there were a number of different stages, and that after the Constantine the Great, there was a continuation of building activities there. It wasn't as if everything was completed at the time of Constantine the Great. That changes our perception. By the way, I've done excavations in the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, and I've come across a similar phenomenon, that some of the features which have been attributed to either to Constantine the Great or to Justinian later on, clearly were part and parcel of the ongoing building works that were taking place there after Constantine the Great and before Justinian. So it's a similar kind of sort of phenomenon. Note here this the top of this sewage pipe from the time of Constantine the Great, early 4th century, extending all the way down to the bottom. You can see that here in this picture as well. Now, this is the map that I've created of the 4th century. Probably it'll need to be twigged and changed a little bit as a result of the current excavations. But I think it does give you the overall sort of sense of things based on the evidence that I had at my disposal in the up to the publication of the book in 1994. This is there was a street which led up a couple of steps to a kind of forecourt, and then you've got the martyrium with 2 aisles on either side of the nave, the apse, this garden area, the area of the Rock of Golgotha, which was left as a kind of memorial to the crucifixion, and then the Edicule here at the center, rather the rock with the tomb chamber, which was surrounded later on during the Constantinian, the successors of Constantinian with this rotunda, semicircular structure. Now, I just want to go, if you notice here, this area here, it was always assumed that there must be some sort of grotto there, especially since there's this tradition of Helena. And so I'm going to show you some of the work which was done then, when I was digging there with an Israeli archaeologist, Megan Broshi. You go down these steps, you can see the steps here in this image, which is quite ancient. I mean, it's an old map. You can see the Edicule here. That's the Parvis, the entrance, the Grotto of Calvary. Then you've got the steps going down, the Chapel of St. Helena, and you've got this cave, which is shown here, the cave where, according to tradition, you can see it here in this engraving on the right and the photographic image that I took on the left, the place of the discovery of remnants of the cross by Queen Helena, mother of Constantine. Turns out from the archaeological work that this cave actually was a cistern at some point. So the question is, was this a cistern that existed back in the 1st century? No evidence of that, but you can see on the left here the signs of quarrying, vertical quarrying, and then some quarrying of the roof as well, and the lower parts as well. So this was a kind of underground cavity where stones were being extracted in the Iron Age through to the time of Jesus at least. And then if you go behind through this doorway here, behind this wall, which is from the time of Constantine, you will reach, that's the other side of the door there, an excavation area. And I have to say, I feel very lucky that I was only a teenager at the time, but this Israeli archaeologist called me up and said, would you like to come and dig in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher? And I said, of course, I'm not going to say no. And I did the architectural surveying there. I did all the drawings and recording at the site. What you see here is the 11th century wall, which is supporting the chapel. So the chapel itself undoubtedly dates to the 11th century, not before. So there doesn't seem to have been a grotto there at the time of Constantine. Not only that, but the wall, you can see these are the cave which is beyond the chapel. The wall itself, this is the foundation of one of the external walls of the Constantinian period. The cement, which is between, you see the gray cement here, still has stones stuck in it, which means that the mortar was still wet when they poured all of the soil down to fill it up after they'd established the firm foundations that they needed for the construction of this church. What is also interesting is that the fragments of walls which are found down there, which proceed in time, they're cut by the Constantinian wall, and so they have to be earlier. Hence, they must be from the time of Hadrian. So these must be consolidation walls, and we found more evidence of that. They reuse, there's 10th Legion stamped tiles, we use bits of masonry which date back to the late Roman period, but they're reused early Roman components there. One of the walls there has this amazing drawing of a ship on it. It's now been encased. That's how it looks today in the new Armenian chapel of St. Gregorian. This is a kind of sort of close-up of the way it looks. And you can see it. It reads supposedly Domine Ivamus in Latin. And you've got a ship representation. And I'm sure some of you have seen representations of pagan ships of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It seems similar. And what I want to show you is that, unfortunately, some work was done of restoration, and it shows you that when it comes to restoring paintings and restoring artifacts, it has to be done by professionals. And unfortunately, it was not done by professionals, which means that the picture that I just showed you is a kind of reconstruction of an original painting that was there. Luckily for us, photographs were taken by archaeologists from the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem at the time of the discovery. And through a friend, Archie Walls, I was able to work on it. And as a result, we can now reconstruct what that ship looks like. And it's an amazing ship representation. There's a little boat there. Let me just show you what it looks like if you add in all the information about this merchant ship of the Navis Honoraria type, 2nd to 3rd centuries, either whales and in the area of the brow, you can see the different sort of components, very typical of that period. The mast, look at the mast there. It's on its side, so it's been demasted. So clearly this is some kind of votive inscription and drawing, perhaps by a sailor who arrives at this pagan location and wants to thank the pagan gods, perhaps, for being saved. Maybe there was a shipwreck, or maybe it was demasted when they just got to shore and he was just thankful and wanted to make sure that on his return trip, nothing further would happen. But this is very typical of that time period. Now, the inscription has been read by different people in different ways, and you can offer your version as well. So that's the inscription, and there are different readings. Isis Merionimus, which of course would refer to Isis, the goddess. Sven Helms. Domine Ivamus was proffered by Pierre Benoit, who was a Dominican priest, and others as well. And you can see a whole list of. Broschi thought it was a reference to Psalm 121:1, which is in Domum Domini Ivamus, we shall go to the house of the Lord, a kind of reference to pilgrims arriving at Jerusalem and arriving at the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. It's nice, but it doesn't fit with the archaeology. But, there are different sort of opinions on this. The most recent has been John Wilkinson, who is no longer with us. He suggests it's the name of a Roman soldier, and it was also a token of coming into harbor safely. So if any of you wish to write an article and defy all of these and come up with a new theory, I'll be very happy. So just in general, I can just sort of say that I think that on iconographic grounds, this is a Roman merchantman of the 2nd or 3rd centuries. Lord, I went, or perhaps a reference to a vow the soldier had undertaken. And stratigraphically, that means in archaeological terms, it is connected to these consolidation walls that existed under the forum, which suggests that maybe we should be dating it to 130 to be more exact at CE. In any case, it preceded in time Constantinian's early 4th century CE church. And remember earlier I showed you the Constantinian wall that Professor Stosola has uncovered. And here you can see another one of these pipes. They've used a kind of a break in the pipe there to put an electrical lamp there, but that's a pipe which descends down as well from the upper level of the church itself and the paving below. As you can see these substantial walls which were put in there. And that brings me finally to sort of say, I apologize, there's not enough time to talk about the amazing medieval structure there, the 11th century building complex, the 12th century building complex, I can refer you to the articles of my friend and colleague Dennis Pringle, Professor Dennis Pringle, who's written substantially about it. This building has an enormous amount of treasures. Only recently, a stone was found, was turned over and placed against the wall, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Amit Raem, sort of identifies it as possibly part of the altar that existed in the 12th century within the church. So who knows what other finds will be found in the future. And I find buildings such as this, complex buildings such as this, intriguing, because you never know what is going to be found. A stone is taken out, is turned over, and there's an inscription. A cavity is removed, and it turns out there's another hidden cavity behind. But all of it is really important, and we now have a fairly good idea as a result of all of these excavations culminating in this substantial, monumental work by Professor Stasola, and I'm very happy that she was able to allow me to show you the images of the recent excavations, because they are now in the throes of preparing everything for publication, but maybe a few years before you can actually see the results of their work. And so I think you now know a bit about what has been found there, and it is truly amazing. We now know so much that we did not know. And this, of course, is it's something that stimulates archaeologists, because we want to know more. And so, I'm sure that the research will continue, and analysis and reinterpretation of some of these earlier results, including the excavations that I just mentioned near the chapel of Saint Helena, will take place, and we'll learn more about that intriguing place called the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem. And I'm very glad to be giving this lecture at a place where you have this amazing exhibition concerning some of the important artifacts of much later periods, of course, not archaeological, but still coming and being associated with that special holy place. Let us hope for peace, and that all of you will be able to travel over there safely and see the newly restored Church of Holy Sepulcher, and some of these archaeological remains which will be allowed to be restored and allowed to be seen by visitors. On that note, thank you very much for coming here. My thanks to Kimball Art Museum, to the curator, Nancy Edwards, and Rebecca Goss, who organized some of the logistics, and for the use of these amazing images that I've been able to show you. So I've credited some of the people. As you can see on the left, I do have a general book which I wrote about final days of Jesus in Jerusalem, trying to sort of sum up what we know about from archaeology about the movements of Jesus in. So thank you again.